You're listening to episode 87 of Present Moments. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. David Victorson joins us to speak about True North Treks, which does mindfulness trips for teens and young adults with cancer. Take a moment and think about how mindfulness has influenced your life. What was it like for you? How has it changed things? If you're like me, you probably encountered the practice later in life, and it's helped you change the way you engage with what life brings, including suffering and illness. What would it have been like to have mindfulness at an earlier age, along with others doing the practice as you go through one of the most difficult times of your life? Dr. David Victorson is a faculty member at Northwestern University and currently conducts research on mindfulness meditation through his lab, Consciousness in Health. In addition, David is the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization called True North Treks. True North Treks provides free week-long backpacking and canoeing trips for young adults with cancer. Special thanks to Carly Megan Maletich for her help in making the connections for today's interview. Our guest today is David Victorson. David, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm so very glad to be doing this. And again, special thanks to Carly Maletich for setting this up. Thank you so much, Carly, for your help with this. So, David, let's start by asking you about your background and how you came to Northwestern.
Sure. So I have a PhD in counseling psychology, which I got at the University of Miami in the early 2000s. And my focus while doing my clinical training was health psychology focus. So working a lot with people with different medical conditions, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, people with cancer, and helping people in different ways from diagnosis or early injury or onset of disease through treatment, rehab, all the way into survivorship or post-acute care frameworks. Mm-hmm. And prior to my PhD training, I had a master's in mental health counseling that I got from Indiana University. And prior to that time, I had been living in South and Central America and in Spain for quite some time, where I taught English and did development work in the countryside in rural areas. Prior to that, I came from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I grew up and went to high school and had a pretty normal youth. But I would say that people from the UP all have as a common denominator that whether they like it or not, they are exposed to nature.
Yeah, Yoopers, for the rest of you who don't know.
Absolutely. They're exposed to nature in lots of different ways, whether it's, incredible snow days or whether your family like mine participated actively in the outdoors, where most of our vacations were spent fishing, camping, hiking, and even hunting. And so I spent a great amount of my childhood in nature and grew up hearing a poem that my grandmother Victorson would recite called Forest Cathedral, which I can't recite to you now. It's available on our True North Treks website, I think. Basically, her son Dale died when he was 17 years old. And she, as you would expect, she sunk into a deep depression because of that. And at some point, my grandpa had the wherewithal to take her out into the woods where they just went out and sat with
Mm.
nature. And this poem came to her that essentially is her catharsis and her healing moment that nature helped her find from the death of her son. So this
Mm.
poem, Forest Cathedral, which was recited to me many times by my grandmother, is an anchoring poem in my life, and certainly something that helped me see from a very early age that there are aspects of nature and being exposed to nature that are healing for us, that are restorative for us, and that there's so much we do not know. And our measurement tools, our scientific ability is just in the prehistoric age at its
Mm.
ability to really understand what's happening with our interactions with nature. But that was impacting
Mhm.
and has followed me and called me, sometimes screamed at me throughout my life in different ways. So, fast forwarding a bit, when I lived in South and Central America, I was also exposed to different healing traditions. I spent time with a shaman in Ecuador. I was exposed when I was spending time in Cuba with Santeria. It's an Afro Caribbean religious practice that
Mhm.
has its origins from West Africa and Christianity. And when I was at the University of Miami, being such a culturally diverse melting pot, I had the opportunity to create a class and teach a class to graduate students on non traditional healing approaches. And so we had people come in that were voodoo practitioners, Santeria practitioners, shamans, and we even had a local Buddhist Osho come in and talk about his lifestyle and things that he did. All of these things contributed and were affecting how I was seeing the client therapist healing relationship. And my supervisor at the time was a mindfulness practitioner and supervised me from a mindfulness based perspective. So I had lots of different pathways in to this world. At some point, one of my interns, while I was getting my training, I was overseeing several interns, and she asked me if I knew who John Kabat-Zinn was and if I had heard of mindfulness-based stress reduction,
Mm.
and I hadn't. And so I bought the requisite books and read them and got excited about it. And after graduate school, I did a postdoctoral fellowship up in Chicago with the same group that I'm at right now at Northwestern. And this fellowship was in psychosocial oncology. So I was working directly with people diagnosed with cancer and seeing day to day their life struggles and challenges. And I happened to work with several young adults who were my age. I was in my early 30s. I had just had my daughter, and they had just had their daughter, but they had cancer, and some of them didn't make it. And it was traumatic for me to be working with people just like me in so many ways, but had been dealt such a bad hand of cards with cancer. I academically attached myself to mindfulness for many years. I
Mm.
read all the books, I gave presentations, I talked to my patients about the importance of doing it, yet I wasn't doing it. I was not practicing it. It was so academically incredibly interesting for me and made sense in so many ways,
Yeah.
yet I was not a practitioner. And so I made a deal with myself. I had enough knowledge and I think clinical skill from my training to lead a group. And I said, I'm going to start a mindfulness class here at the hospital, at the cancer center, a drop in mindfulness class. And if that doesn't make me honest and make me start a practice, nothing will.
Mhm.
And it worked. I felt really committed to practicing it if I was going to be teaching it. And I sought out other people in the area who provided me with some informal supervision, mentorship, and guidance. And so that's how I started. I started for about 5 years. I taught a biweekly drop-in mindfulness class at the cancer center, and it was a really wonderful experience. And then after I had tasted a little bit of the Kool-Aid, I found someone to fund me to take the 7-day professional training at Mount Madonna in San Jose, California with John and Saki. And so I spent a week in that formative training with them and with other healthcare professionals. And it was life-changing. I had been reticent and kind of somewhat vigilant about not attaching myself too much to them. I was aware of the discipleship of both of them. I just really wanted to make sure that my intentions were pure. And I felt like I had to fight that during that week with them because I'm like, oh my God, there's John Kabat-Zinn. He's teaching me this right now. But at the same time, I got to watch it and learned that that was part of it. John sat next to me at lunch one day. And it's kind of weird for me to even say John because I don't know him and I don't talk, I feel like I know people who know him and they say John, and I'm doing that right now, but I feel weird even saying that. I mean, I have to say John Kabat-Zinn sat down next to me, and it was really surprising to me because I had all these illusions of who I thought he was and would be. Certainly, I consider him to be a poet first and foremost. The way he loves and uses language to get his point across is inspiring for me. And so I was bedazzled at just listening to how he talked. And I found the same thing in his books. I just love reading how he writes. But I was really taken aback because he wasn't this Dalai Lama kind of, glowing with joy, I don't know, kind of like benevolent figure. He was kind of like this old professor I used to work with who had done 20 years of psychoanalysis. This professor, like you could tell his eyes were worn. He had seen the truth in his own life and in others. And you were getting like the raw, real him. And sometimes it wasn't like rosy. And I think I had this impression that John Kabat-Zinn, by the way he wrote, would be this, like I said, benevolent, lovely, pious figure. And he sat down with me and he almost, I was probably projecting, but he almost had this unhappy look on his face, and he said, "What brings you here?" I was like, holy crap! I don't know how to answer that question. But anyway, it was. I still remember that day and that moment, and it was great because I keep asking myself that question since. I probably didn't have a good answer at the time, and I think I've been able to answer it better along the way. It's funny. I've internalized that question in his voice, even saying to me, "What brings you here now with what you're doing now with all of this?"
And there's a reason that's one of the questions that we start with in the MBSR program is, why are you here? And sit with that and explore the depths of it.
Yeah. So I did that formative training and I came back from it, and I knew right then and there, I was in a primarily research position. I transitioned from doing more clinical work, clinical psychotherapy or counseling, to research. And I remember going to my boss, my chair, saying, "I want to research mindfulness, and I want to do as much as I can to learn more about this." My chair is a very, I would say, wise, experienced, open-minded person, and the look on his face, I saw the micro expression of, "You don't want to do that."
I was wondering if he was going to be one of the ones who said, "No, don't do that," or, "Hey, that's a great idea."
Yeah, it was more on the, "No, don't do that." That's why I walked away from that conversation going, okay, so how am I going to do this using my own version of the Underground Railroad? I mean, I had to really kind of hide in certain ways what I was doing because I felt like it wasn't going to be okay to go above ground with it. And this was in the early to mid 2000s. Mindfulness had been growing in terms of research, but I would say not quite to the place where it is today. I realized that I started reading my audience correctly, and I would not say mindfulness research. I would say I'm interested in emotion regulation research. I'm interested in contemplative awareness practices. I would kind of go around what I was interested in. I finally found some funding from a like-minded foundation to fund my first pilot study. And then once I had money to do it, nobody could stop me. I was like, all right, this is happening now. And so since that first pilot study, our research lab at Northwestern is called Consciousness in Health. And we've got many randomized controlled trials of mindfulness-based interventions, primarily with people with cancer. Some studies are National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute funded, others are foundation funded. And some studies focus on medical students and medical residents and using mindfulness training to facilitate a present awareness connection with them during their encounters with patients. So here I am now at Northwestern with this lab with many mindfulness related research studies. And, I feel like it's all connected. I still struggle with a regular practice. Just like I equate it to a health behavior, like my exercise practice
right.
and like my diet practice. I cringe at people calling mindfulness a technique. And I say, would you ever call eating a healthy diet a technique? Like, it's a lifestyle, man. And so I have my relapse moments and I have my good and bad days. My practice informs my research. And through True North Tracks, my ability to teach also informs everything.
So for folks who are listening, and just so you're aware, I'll be including links to consciousnessinhealth.org. That's what that is, as well as True North Tracks. And I want to go to that now, David. Tell us about True North Tracks. What is that and what do you do?
Sure. So I mentioned that I'm from the UP. Spent a lot of time in the outdoors and just really get soul fed from being in nature. And I mentioned that I had some, I would say, what's it called? Vicarious traumatic experiences working with young adults with cancer in some of my early training. And then you've heard about my mindfulness journey. And so for many years, I had this calling of how can I bring the three of these things together in a meaningful and purposeful way? And the volume began to turn up on it, and it became a screaming at a certain point. And I finally said to my wife, I've got to do something about this or I'm going to go crazy. And so we found a way to basically, we started True North Tracks, which is a nonprofit organization that serves teens and young adults with cancer. Right now, our age range is 18 to 39. The National Cancer Institute or American Cancer Society age is 15 to 39, but we started with young adults to start with. Because their situation is so different than children with cancer and older adults with cancer, it's just such a different paradigm altogether. They get diagnosed much later than those other two groups. When they do get diagnosed, they have more advanced disease because it's taken them so long to get diagnosed. Mm-hmm. Their mortality rates have not changed since the mid-1970s, whereas young children and older adults, their mortality rates have gotten increasingly better and better over time. So there's all these factors against them. And then being diagnosed as a young adult, a developmental period that is so chock-a-block with developmental milestones and changes that is second only to gestation in terms of how many important things are happening. They get halted in their tracks, disconnected or derailed from the life that they were pursuing. And many have to drop out of high school or college, have to stop working that first job that they had, lose friends, lose important, significant relationships, may become infertile because of treatment. And so there's just so many things happening to this group that we created True North Tracks as a support service that was above and beyond what already might be available in a community setting, like a support group, where we can take groups out into nature, where we take them into the backcountry in Wyoming, Montana, Utah, Oregon, Minnesota, the Upper Peninsula. And we really use nature as a holding environment from which it's a constant teacher of mindfulness, where they can experience the restorative qualities of being in nature. They can then also be with their peers, many of many young adults say they don't know any other young adults with cancer. They're sitting in a waiting room with their grandparents, it feels like, or they go to a support group and it's with people who are not like them. Right. So they all of a sudden get to spend a whole week with people who are very much like them. And that deep social connection is tremendously powerful. And then we spend every day waking up, doing morning yoga, practicing our mindfulness curriculum, going to bed with either yoga or mindfulness. And it's just woven very naturally throughout the week that those three connections, connection to nature, connecting to peers, connecting to themselves through mindfulness and yoga, we've found that they can be incredibly powerful experiences that can help get young adults back on track after their treatment.
And knowing that you may have many of these, I'm wondering if you might be able to share just one story that has moved you, that comes to mind when you reflect on this work as rewarding.
One of the people that come to mind is a guy named Jeff. Jeff went on 2 treks. So we have a pay it forward pledge model where you get to go completely for free. We pay for your flight, transportation, food, all the guide services, everything. We do ask everybody who goes to consider making a pledge to help pay it forward to the next participant. And that kind of ties into our gratitude and compassion components of the organization. We don't send anybody after you if you can't, but we appeal to the better angels of people. And we do find that the vast majority of our participants want to help pay it forward to somebody else. We ask them to fundraise $1,200 or more for someone else. So you don't get to go on 2 treks though unless you pay it forward the first time. So Jeff went on his first trek, had an incredible experience, and Jeff had stage 4 cancer and was not doing too well, and really wanted to do another trek. He saw what was imminent. And he was physically and his health, his cancer was at a phase where he actually could go on another trek. It wouldn't be a great risk to him to do it. But Jeff went on his second trek, and the night before everyone was to meet, everyone was flying in, Jeff was nowhere to be seen. We didn't know where he was. He didn't show up. We found out he ended up coming early the next morning. We found out that he had been hospitalized. He had uncontrollable diarrhea. Jeff had bowel cancer, I believe, that had metastasized to lots of places in his body. And usually we go back and check with his oncologist to make sure he's okay to continue to go. Well, he didn't really give us much of a chance here. He just showed up, and we're like, all right, we're gonna do this. And Jeff had another incredible experience that week. And after the trek, we found out that Jeff did this trek with us in a canoe in Montana, but he did this whole trek with a broken back that none of us knew about. He complained about back pain, but he, was going to be damned if he was not going to get to do this trek, knowing what was to come. And Jeff died shortly thereafter. And we have written diaries from Jeff about his time on our treks that talk about how meaningful this was for him, how much it helped him truly be with the people he loved near the end of his life, how mindfulness in particular helped him get through grueling treatments near the end and spend the last few days with his wife, Chriselle, in the way that, was on his terms that he wanted to. And so I'll never forget Jeff and what he brought to our organization. Jeff, in fact, was the one who suggested that we create a caregiver survivor trek so that the spouse or caregiver can actually go as well and benefit along with the participants. So we have started, because of Jeff, our caregiver survivor experiences where you can bring any loved one, friend, parent, spouse to come with you.
It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story, David. And as I'm reflecting on looking at a journal that is sitting at the waiting room at Humphrey Cancer Center near Minneapolis in Minnesota, the experiences that are shared in that that I read tended to be of a different nature. And there's more suffering evident in them. And yet what you shared is that this was a very different experience. And I'm wondering if you've found that the mindfulness treks, these that you do, shift that experience for the people who are experiencing, in some cases, end of life, and sometimes it's a struggle, and they're going to get through it. But there's tremendous difficulty and suffering there.
Yeah.
Are you seeing there's a consistency with this shifting in their relationship to the experience?
I think that I do think that is the case. I think there's something about being taken away from your environment, transported into the backcountry where you're living a very basic and primitive life for a week, experiencing things that you always do, like going to the bathroom or trying to fall asleep or eat, be in communication with other people, but so differently. Not being able to have your phone work because where we go, your reception does not work. I do think that our holding environment of nature offers such a different way to sit with all of this and to do it with other people who have walked a very similar walk. Again, it's powerful in big medicine. We operate sometimes in places where there are actual dangers. One of our primary first goals is safety, and we make sure that all of our treks are equipped with all the expert guides and resources to make sure that nothing bad happens to a person when they go. That said, we do operate in grizzly bear country in a couple of our places, in rattlesnake country, and we've had encounters with various wildlife. And some people have talked about how it's interesting, the metaphor of the grizzly bear, that we can do everything we can to prevent a grizzly bear from coming into our camp. We can eat 100 yards from where we sleep, 100 yards from where we hang our food. We can make sure we do a pocket dump every night and get rid of all of our wrappers and things that smell like food. We can bring a bear spray can with us when we go to the bathroom with a partner. We can yell, "Hey, bear," and ring a bell or whatever when we're hiking. Do all of these things, yet at the end of the day, we have to somewhat let go and give up, knowing that if there's a rogue grizzly bear that decides to come through our camp, it's going to do it. And a participant had made this analogy to their cancer experience, that I can do everything I can to try and keep cancer from coming back. I can eat healthy, I can exercise, I can try to manage my stress, I can take preventive medicines and make sure I do all these things. Yet at the end of the day, if cancer decides to come storming through my camp, it's going to do that. And I think that there's something that happens with this ability to watch all of the teaching moments in nature that can help bring it back to the front country for some of our participants.
So I understand there's a documentary in the works as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we have been very fortunate to have been given a nice, sizable donation that will allow us to create a professional documentary of our treks. It wasn't something that we were necessarily on the hunt for, but someone had made the offer and suggested that it was something that could be of benefit for us to help get the word out about what we're doing and how we're doing it. We're the only organization. There are other organizations that do take young adults into outdoor experiences, wonderful organizations. There's one called First Descents, Athletes for Cancer, Epic Experiences, Thrive and Survive. Many of them have similar philosophies. We're the only one, though, that in our core approach try to bring together these three connections of connecting with nature, with peers, and with ourselves through contemplative awareness practices. And because of that, it's important for us to make sure that people know about us. And so we think that through this documentary, we're going to be able to have screenings at every cancer treatment center across the country and really let other people know that this opportunity is available to them at any time during or after their treatment, if they're cleared to go. And so we'll be sending a professional filmmaking crew on two of our treks this next year. One will be at the Wind River Range in Wyoming. It's a caregiver survivor backpacking trek. And the other one will be on the Green River. It's a canoeing trek in Utah for survivors only. And, there will be another factor there where people will be filmed and our experience will be documented. So it's a bit of an unknown how it's going to transpire. But we've been told by our filmmaker who's done similar films that people tend to habituate to or forget that the filming is even happening after about an hour, and that people just kind of continue on with how things are going. So we're really excited about it. I'm a little nervous, and it's added work for us, but it's all good because at the end of the day, we're going to be able to let other people virtually go on a track and really get to see see and experience what it's like for people.
Best wishes with that. David, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, you brought that up in the pre-interview Q&A and made me think about something that's been on my mind lately related to mindfulness. I just gave a grand rounds talk to a group of hospitalists at Northwestern on mindful awareness practices and medicine and healthcare. And I started this talk by reading for them an editorial, an op-ed from the New York Times back in November of 2016 from someone who, I can't remember her name, but basically the op-ed was on the case for not living in the moment. It was essentially a critique or a criticism on the mindfulness movement and, in this person's mind, craze. And, her point was, we have autopilot for a reason. Maybe it's good for us. And maybe learning to tune into our present moments isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And, she gave lots of examples. And I recently read another similar one, something like, "Is mindfulness making us ill?" It was in The Guardian in 2016. And it was a similar kind of negatively skewed criticism of the mindfulness movement. And I guess I would say, I'm, as a researcher, I have an obligation to be skeptical. I have an obligation to not drink the Kool-Aid. And obviously, I have a bias that I think there's good things happening here. If I'm going to spend this many aspects of my life focusing on this, at the same time, I have to try to keep it front and center, these biases, and also to try and not look for significant findings because I want to make sure that this looks like it's working. So I'm the first person to critique the
unfiltered acceptance is something I'd heard recently.
Unfiltered acceptance of the use of mindfulness in things that really don't have to do with mindfulness.
Right.
Using them more as marketing tools. So I take pictures now. It's one of my hobbies is to take pictures wherever I can of applications of the word mindful or Zen in things that don't have anything to do with them. So I've got a mindful burger, like there's Epic Burger that has a mindful burger. There's a mindful doggy daycare. There are lots of different things where you can, I think there are mindful peanuts. Like there's a whole sector of society that is helping us bastardize this already bad word. I sometimes will say mindfulness is a crappy word in and of itself because it just means so many different things to so many different people. And, it focuses on the mind where it's obviously so much more than that. But I guess my point, in terms of an additional piece is that I feel like some of these critiques, it's pretty simple for me to see where these are not people who have actually begun to have a form of practice. They're saying things and voicing assumptions of what this is supposed to be for them, that it's supposed to be this relaxing, blissful experience. And I feel like that's the first thing I try and disabuse someone of
right.
when we talk about this, that this is the wrong thing for you to get into if you think it's about, getting relaxed. You should try guided imagery or something else.
Right. And, we don't use the word relax in our guided meditations for a reason.
And so anyway, I would say that, for me, that's just been a recent point of interest and focus is trying to listen open-minded and heartedly to people who are challenged or struggling with this notion of mindfulness, agreeing with them that it has taken on a commercial, identity that is somewhat uncomfortable for me. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, not wanting to shame or blame them that their experience isn't authentic, that maybe they have been hurt by it. But at the same time, keeping it real that most people, when, coached a little bit by someone that can help them through some of the challenges, most people are able to tune in, as John Kabat-Zinn would say, live their lives as if they were actually worth living. Yeah. And so I would hate for the baby to be thrown out with the bathwater with some of these publications without more discussion around it.
Thank you for bringing that up, David. In fact, we've had several episodes exploring exactly those kinds of criticisms and what keeps coming up, because I remember reading both of those articles and many more that you mentioned. And what strikes me as common threads to them is that the writer has a lack of experience with a program that's been a long-standing one that has a certain authenticity and reputation for positive effects. Mm-hmm. So it will have been I went to this one thing for an afternoon.
Yes.
And
I once read an article about it.
And then I wrote an article. That's like saying I went to medical school for a day and I'm going to write about brain surgery. It's maybe a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah. And I would agree with many of the statements that are made about there's an increasing hype static that's out there. I'm honored to be a co-author on a paper that'll be coming out soon on minding the hype, being careful of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what the much more intelligent authors included in there are things around the kind of science we do, that it's not measuring the rate of an object falling in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's not that. And it's much more complex in different ways because it's human behavior. And the more biometric measures we can include, the more active controls we can do, watching for, as you said, it was just in this conversation the other day, being aware of our own biases and making sure that we're controlling for confirmation bias, making sure that we're not tempting, though it may be, to do p-hacking in our results.
Exactly.
Are all important things around this delivery of beneficial, good mindfulness. And it's funny whenever I hear the mindfulness being used and it's being misapplied and things it doesn't apply to. Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance.
Exactly.
This was started in the tradition, so let's have a little context here.
Yes.
David, thank you so much for being here. Folks who are listening, I will link these on the episode page for this episode, truenorthtreks.org. Be sure to check that out, as well as consciousnessinhealth.org. Our guest today, David Victorson. David, thank you so much for being here.
Ted, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this and for just the opportunity to share all of this with you and the listeners. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment You have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.